What's good, fire starters? Welcome to episode 5 of Into the Fire. Today we're going to look at how exploring your dark side can be good for your creativity and your mental health. Let's go! Alright, so for this week I wanted to really look into exploring whether the dark side of artists is helpful for creativity, for art, for just creating good work. Something I've been really always kind of intrigued by ever since the days of heavy metal, like Nine Inch Nails, Rage Against the Machine, Marilyn Manson to a certain extent, Metallica, right? Megadeth. All these guys were exploring their dark sides really and creating fucking awesome music. And I wanted to really dive in and see how we can take some creative energy from that dark side of us, which we all have. And I looked at a book this week called The Upside of Your Dark Side: Why Being Your Whole Self, Not Just Your Good Self, Drives Success and Fulfillment, by Todd Kashdan, Ph.D. and Robert Biswas-Diener, Ph.D. Sort of the takeaway I didn't think I was going to get from this book was that we as individuals are so obsessed with positivity, like positive psychology, positive vibes. Everything needs to be positive, and it's kind of it's strange because we've never been as a society more depressed and lacking in mental health than right now. And yet at the same time, we've been so obsessed, never been so obsessed with positivity and self-help books. And I know I'm kind of contradicting myself here because I look at some of these books, but I also have kind of a cynicism towards them because I don't know if it's just an LA thing, but I know so many people around here that are so about positivity and meditation and all this good stuff. And while I don't have anything against it, it's not helping. I can just, I don't know if it's intuition or just my history as being a psychologist, but I can just tell that these people are not as happy as they preach their self-help, positive mentalities to. And so I'm going to try, I don't want to be like Debbie Downer about this, but I also don't want people to preach positivity and try to live a positive life when they're really torn up inside. And so what this book says basically is that instead of always being positive, you have to embrace your negative emotions because they're actually helpful, and you can't always be happy. Like, nobody's always happy. Anybody that says they're always happy or appears to be always happy should be the most suspect people because they're probably hiding a lot under the hood, right? So, all right, let's get into it. So the authors kind of attack this, what they call gung-ho happyology, which I kind of snickered at because that's kind of what it seems like is a really gung-ho. Like, look at me, we're so happy, yay. But it's kind of, and to me, it's a little bit of false, a little bit of fakeness. But they say that people who are able to use their whole range of psychological gifts, both positive and negative, can draw from the full range of human emotions, and therefore are the healthiest and often the most successful. So the authors start out by stating that basically happiness all the time doesn't provide an evolutionary advantage. There's no survival mechanism to always be happy. If there was, then there'd be a happiness epidemic instead of an epidemic of depression and anxiety. Their take on it is that there is an evolutionary reason for mild states of anxiety and depression and negative emotions. So with regards to creativity, the authors looked at a study that found that individuals that express negative and positive moods were 10% more creative than individuals that just experience happy moods. And while 10% does sound kind of minimal, scale that over a year or even a lifetime. If you can be 10% more creative in your work, And I want to make clear that it's not an equal seesaw. You shouldn't be expressing negative moods as much as you should positive, right? You should be positive majority of the time. The authors say 80% of the time. But there's the 20%, they call the 20% edge, that is super crucial, and that you need to not squelch, not prevent, not fight your negative emotions. You got to let those breathe. And speaking of fighting, the authors found that 1 in 3 Americans is afflicted by anxiety. So it's just something that needs to be not only addressed, but not pushed under or repressed. There are ways of taking that anxiety and putting it to use. Now, it sounds crazy, but this book is so good because they back it up with study after study. And I love this passage where the authors are like, we're always trying to avoid discomfort. Like, especially now, 2018, with our smartphones, they say, we whip out our smartphones the moment we're left alone, boredom vanquished. We jockey for the fastest line on the freeway, no frustrating waits. We flip on the television when we get home from work, no other unwinding and de-stressing needed. What most folks don't realize is that this seemingly natural attraction to an easier life is rooted in avoidance of discomfort. People who fear rejection avoid meeting others, right? Like, this is kind of tangential, but I read somewhere that people are not going out to social events as much anymore, like bars or clubs. They'd rather, and I've heard people actually say this, that they'd rather just stay home and go on Tinder or Bumble or whatever the fuck is these days. And so people fear rejection, and so they avoid meeting others. People who fear failure don't take risks, and people who fear intimacy turn on the TV and email when they get home from work. Avoidance is a tectonic issue of our time. We're all running from pain, basically, from discomfort, and it's making us a weak society. This issue is going to get worse and worse unless we do something about it. Like, the more we avoid our problems, the more we avoid finding solutions to them. And the consequence of avoiding these negative states is that you're stunting your growth, your maturity, the adventure in your life, and any meaning and purpose that you find in it. It's a big deal. Like, for instance, doubt, right? A lot of, people will say, don't doubt yourself, always feel confident and believe in yourself. You can do it. Yeah, great. But having a certain amount of doubt is important because it prompts us to take stock of our skills and to work to improve in areas where they might be deficient, so say the authors. In a study that looked at teachers experiencing uncertainty about their performance, their feelings of doubt actually spurred collaboration with others. It fostered personal reflection, motivated personal development, and it prepared the person to accept change. And the authors, their wording is great. They say that when you have positive and negative feelings and thoughts, you're a whole person. And I guess you could deduce from that if you're always thinking positively all the time, you're an incomplete person. And I know that sounds wild, but it makes a lot of sense when I go through all of this stuff. And they say the trick to being whole is to not avoid these negative emotions, but to take the negative out of them and to squeeze basically the usefulness, the utility of these negative emotions. And they quote Muhammad Ali. I love this. I hated every minute of training, but I said, don't quit, suffer now, and live the rest of your life as a champion. You can't avoid suffering if you're training for something that's difficult. I mean, it sounds obvious, but you need to be able to embrace that struggle to progress in life. You have to be comfortable with your negative emotions. You should not push them under the rug. You should not suppress them. You should embrace them. And like the book says, take the usefulness out and move on, move forward. And what's interesting about this book also is that they look into mindfulness, which is the state you get in when you're meditating, right? And I meditate regularly, and I just started doing like yoga every now and then. And I definitely see the benefits, but at the same time, and I don't want to be, like this shit talker, but I meet quite a few people who they say they meditate, but I'll have conversations with them further and find that they're struggling mentally, like they're just depressed or anxious, and that the mindfulness practice that they're practicing on a regular basis is not helping them, as goes the popular notion, right? Like, I just feel like when people say they meditate, they want to express that they are going through a life-changing epiphany type of experience, when in reality, it's not the magic bullet that a lot of people like to give the impression that it is. And what I thought was kind of paradoxical is that the more comfortable your life is, the less patient you're likely to be with your problems. So, kind of racks my brain a little bit. The more comfort you're experiencing, the more mental illness, mental health problems you could potentially experience. And I guess this happened in the mid-90s, really, this phenomenon where as we became more comfortable in our lives as a society, researchers observed a related drop in our psychological health. Anxiety, in particular, was on the rise. And in 1996, it was the first time in history that students at college health clinics began complaining of anxiety more frequently than they sought help for depression or relationship problems. And this trend continues to increase. So even though as a people we're getting better sleep, we're enjoying more convenience, and we're expecting greater happiness, we're also adjusting to a life without too many trials or hardships. And the term experiential avoidance came into the psychological lexicon. Experiential avoidance can be defined as attempts to bury unwanted thoughts or feelings, to hide from them so actively that we can have little energy left over for being present as life unfolds. It's crazy to think about this, that as the quality of life improves for us, the more we are avoiding our negative emotions, the more we are stuffing them down inside. So the way the authors word it is that it's liberating if we can just enjoy our lives where there are unwanted thoughts and feelings that are not necessarily our enemy, that we're always battling against and trying to defeat. Instead, we should imagine that these thoughts and feelings are like music on the radio, playing in the background. They're always there, but we can choose how much attention is warranted. So you carry your difficult thoughts and feelings inside. You observe them, but you and they are not the same. You disconnect from your negative feelings. They're gonna be there, right? Like, you can push them under the rug, you can stuff them down inside, you can avoid them, you can try to ignore them, but they're still gonna be there. And instead of trying to repress them, you should take note that they're there, but they're not you. Your negative emotions are not you. The authors really try to drive home that you are not the same thing as your thoughts and feelings. You are not just the uncomfortable thoughts in your mind and the feelings they trigger, precisely because you can observe those thoughts and feelings. Whatever or whoever this observer is, the self, the personality, the soul, call it what you will, it is by definition set apart from those feelings and the fact that you can observe them. When you recognize this observer as being separate from the pain, you can become better at tolerating that pain. I love that passage. It's so strong. It's so impactful. Like, that dark side's always going to be there. We have to acknowledge it and just, like I said, it's not you. It's just there. You observe it. And another kind of paradoxical thing that they say is that when you're trying to avoid anxiety, instead of making us feel calmer, it has the opposite effect of intensifying that anxiety over time. And the way they put it is that when people feel anxious about certain situations, then this stress is compounded by a fear of feeling anxious. So you're anxious that you're anxious. Imagine how much life easier it would be if you could remove this second layer of mental trouble by simply feeling robust enough to withstand anxiety. And I just think mental toughness has gotten us as a species to this point. We need mental toughness. And the authors say if Western societies can open themselves to a little more danger, a bit more risk, a touch more hardship, and even a little more failure, then we stand to regain some of the mental toughness that goes hand in glove with such experiences. Like they say, you cannot get rid of these negative emotions without unintentionally squelching happiness, meaning, grit, curiosity, maturity, wisdom, and personal growth. Like, when you choose to numb these negative emotions, you also numb the positives too. And that's kind of what I was alluding to in episode 2 on bipolar disorder and the use of lithium and how it numbed, for some patients, their positive and negative emotions, but to the point where their creativity was influenced and they lost their kind of drive and their fire for creating, because they were kind of just at too much of a neutral. What this book is saying, to kind of take that week 2 further, is that you can take these negative emotions and these highs and these lows and take the best from each side. And instead of taking drugs to avoid the negative emotions, you can acknowledge that they're there and utilize the best from them. And we as a society, we have a lot more techniques for reducing, terminating, and tolerating negative emotions than we have skills for enhancing positive feelings. We're always focusing on getting rid of the negative, not so much enhancing the positive. And certain negative emotional expressions are really important. They've been passed down through generations because they have an evolutionary advantage. The authors say emotional expressions are an important way in which we communicate with others. A furrowed brow or a frown warns people off when you aren't in the mood. A gasp of fear has a contagious effect such that bystanders also feel a jolt of adrenaline and look around nervously. Expressing feelings, including negative ones, is a big part of the human emotional experience. We can't just always be skipping down the street expressing positive emotions. That's not who we are as people. And a lot of our anxiety stems from the desire to be accepted. And what we need to do is realize that we're not going to be accepted by everyone. And the author, goes into how, even Gandhi and the greatest presidents in history didn't have a 100% approval rate. Like, you're just not going to be accepted by everyone. But we don't have any control over like what people are going to say about us. We can only control how we think and act. But it's this lack of control that we feel that, in conjunction with our almost obsession with being accepted, especially with social media. It's like this feeling of uncertainty that we experience, that if someone, comments negatively on our social media, or we don't get a lot of likes on something, we don't feel accepted. But we can't control that. And I'm thinking out loud here, but I should probably do an episode on the pitfalls of social media, because I had a few few people that were interested in me going into an episode on that. And I think it's the right time to talk about it, because I see it and I'm reading studies on it, and it's such a new and fresh idea in psychology, because social media is pretty young. I'm talking about Instagram. And to quickly go off on a tangent, they did a list of the most detrimental social media channels, and YouTube actually was the best. And then I think it went Facebook in terms of best to worst on your mental health. YouTube, Facebook, I believe Snapchat. I don't know. Facebook, I think Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram was the most detrimental to mental health. And I can totally see why, and just from intuition and from reading some research on it. But I really feel like part of why Instagram is so detrimental to mental health these days, desire to be accepted. We all want to be accepted. We all want people to like us, and we're always constantly putting out photos, selfies of ourselves, and just ourselves typically, which is another thing that kind of concerns me, is that, like when people used to take pictures, they used to be with other people. It used to be like always, like I would never fucking take a picture of just one person, like ever. Like when there was, like actually cameras and stuff. And that's gone now. And all of the photos on social media, sadly, are just one person. And I don't want to keep going further into this, but I did read some research today that stated that actually there was a computer program that these psychologists created that could determine if an individual was depressed more than a therapist could. Therapists have about a 45% accuracy in determining if a patient's depressed, and this computer algorithm, which looked at Instagram, had a 70% success rate. And one of the indicators was the filter, which I thought was really ridiculous, but it's actually legit. But the other indicator was if they had pictures with single people, or if the picture had the less people in the picture, the more the participant tended to be depressed in reality. And so when I see somebody's profile that has a lot of, well, they're all selfies basically, and I understand that some people are actresses and models, and that they have to put their best face forward as far as getting their brand out. I think it's still odd that somebody's personal profile only has pictures of themselves and not with friends typically. The authors explain that people make a mistake not in their desire to avoid the unpleasant, but rather in underestimating their ability to adequately tolerate the distress of negative emotions. We are more than capable of handling unpleasant emotions than we give ourselves credit for. We're basically just overreacting. We're basically just being overdramatic to a certain extent. We're losing our mental toughness as people, which is scary actually. Like, we need our positive and negative emotions both hand in hand. It's like a GPS. It reminds me of that movie, I believe it's I, Robot, where we all become like these fat people who just are on these moving, hovering, mechanical things that provide us food and entertainment and everything, and we don't even have to move. We just lay down in a hovering lazy boy, right? And we can't become this dulled void of any emotion type of people. And that's what I feel like that these authors are kind of alluding to. They say, just imagine living in a world in which no one really felt disappointment when they failed at a cherished goal, or in which you could not access fear even in the presence of a fire in the home basement or a dirty hypodermic needle floating next to you. during an ocean swim. Without so-called negative feelings, we would be living in a world devoid of fully functioning humans. And there's a lot of research that overwhelmingly indicates that feeling angry increases creativity, and it allows for effective performance. Feeling anger is associated with a more optimistic outlook. These are crazy assertions I'm giving you guys, but this is all backed by research. Like, participants in one study that were induced to feel mildly angry took bigger risks. Anger led them to feel more inclined to explore the boundaries of possibility. Like, it's crazy to think that a certain amount of anger was necessary for progress, for evolution, for groundbreaking ideas. And I want to really focus on how anger can spark creativity, because we're all creatives here, and I want to give you guys always information on how you can be better artists, right? And it's super interesting because they look at a study that showed that people performed better when they received angry feedback. The take-home message here is that in some cases, anger led to more creativity. And when I'm giving feedback to people on their music, I try to give them raw feedback. And raw meaning that I want them to improve, so I tell them like it is. I'm never like, great song, bud. I'm always like, this sucks, this needs work, you need to do this. And it's not necessarily angry, but it's real, and probably comes off as pretty extreme to some people. But with this type of feedback, according to this study, people perform better, because in order to get better in anything, you have to receive consistent feedback by someone who's better than you at whatever craft you're working on. And that feedback needs to be completely honest and not holding back and potentially angry. It's like a coach, right? Like, some of the greatest coaches in sports yell their heads off at games and in practice, but it motivates the players and it gets them to perform better. And so it's interesting to look at this and to think about how possibly I have taken a page out of some coaches' books, because I've been obsessed with sports my whole life, and kind of taken that sort of coaching and feedback and expressed it to my students. And now I know why, and I'm glad that I've been doing it, and now I know why so many people appreciate, and I'm not trying to sound arrogant, but I get all the time, like, your feedback sessions are the best because you don't hold back. And I now understand why it's so appreciated and why it's so effective. To come back to the thesis of the book, if I was always positive with people, right? Always like, good job, and like not really getting to the nuts and bolts of why their song is not good, it would be bad feedback, and no one would want to hear from me ever again on how I felt about their songs. Like, anger to a certain extent is useful as a performance enhancement tool. And anger in history is so important. I mean, like, if Martin Luther King Jr. hadn't, what they say, the initial prompt to fight against injustice was motivated by anger. And his anger became a transforming force. It creates better leaders. And that's powerful right there. Like, if Martin Luther King Jr. was passive in the sense that he didn't want any violence, right? But he still took that anger and transmuted it to the people that were being oppressed at the time in a way that still led to change. He utilized anger to its fullest, if that makes sense.